Hi, welcome back to Bookish Brummy. My name's Mel and I like to review books. So today, if you want to hang around, I'm going to review Margaret Atwood's The Blind Assassin. So, I read this book in January. Essentially, it was part of a book reading challenge that I set for the month, which was to read books that are over 500 pages long. Because I'd had quite a few collecting on my shelves, and I'd had this one on my shelf for probably about 4 months. So this was published in the year 2000, and it also won the Booker Prize in the year 2000, which is really good for Margaret Atwood because she had been nominated a few times for the prize, but she'd never actually won it up until this point. And all I can say is I can completely understand why this won the Booker Prize. I'm almost surprised that it hasn't won the Women's Prize for Fiction, if I'm honest, due to the themes in this book. This is just an absolutely phenomenal book, and I think that in the first week where I reviewed all the books that I'd read at the end of the week, I'd started reading this book and I couldn't fully review it because I hadn't finished reading it, but I was about 400 pages in and I spent a lot of time talking about it, and then obviously I need to review it for the end when I'd actually finished it in January. And I thought, do you know what, in order to keep that review short, I'm just going to do a separate video for this book because there's just so much to say about this book. It covers so many things, and I just don't think that actually I could do this justice in a couple of minutes in a normal roundup at the end of, when I do my normal weekly reviews. And I think that, I'm going to try and talk about this without giving any spoilers, and then at the point where I'm actually going to talk about spoilers, then I'll sort of say that that's what's going to happen, so you can sort of switch off at that point, or maybe skip that part of the video if you haven't read the book yet and you're considering reading it. But there's a lot we can say without revealing any plot points, I think. So, as I've mentioned, there's a lot of different aspects to this book, like there's so many different themes. So I suppose the first thing that we'll start out with is how the book's actually laid out. So we have our main character who's called Iris. And at this point, she's an elderly woman, she's in her early 80s, and she's recounting her life basically from childhood up until the present day. And what she's trying to do is while she's telling this story, she's sort of writing it down. So she's writing it down, I suppose, as an end of life thing is what you sort of really realise about it. She's just trying to say all the things that happened in her life, because really actually nobody knows for certain what had happened in all these major junctures with all these major events that had happened. So she's leaving a diary, if you like, but she's sort of written it in retrospect, or she's writing it in retrospect as she's telling her story. However, it's not just Iris remembering by writing down this story of what's happened to her. So you have the book, it's split up into sections, and you'll have a section where Iris is in the present day and she's trying to go about her life as an elderly woman, and she's sort of, reminiscing a bit but also talking about what's happening in that present day, and then she'll sort of go into the story of where she'd last left off of what she's telling us. But in these parts, not only are we learning about her backstory, we're also learning about how she feels as an elderly woman, how she feels in the world, who's currently in her life at that point. And there's some really poignant things in the text, that she writes. Like, there's this one point where she's talking about how she is meant to be walking somewhere, and one of her neighbours, who's really, really, helpful person to her and gives her a lot of help in her daily life, sees her and decides to give her a lift, and drops her off and tells her, you wait there and I'll pick you up in about an hour. And Iris is like, this is what it's like now as an elderly person, like I feel like a letter, I'm just dropped off somewhere, waiting to be picked up by somebody else and then dropped off elsewhere, and you really get this sense of that she doesn't feel as in control of her life at this point. And she even, I think what sort of unravels in this is the idea that even though she wants to be independent and the people around her know that she wants to be independent, they have to pretend like she's independent but she's not really independent. So this neighbour who gives her a lot of help, she sort of Iris talks along, how she goes along with the pretense that, you know, she's not really helping her, but she is helping her. And I think that's really important for our main character's self-esteem, that she feels in control, or that she has autonomy and a say, but she also kind of really knows that there's a lot of people doing a lot of stuff for her, so she's not as independent as she'd like to be. So I think that to begin with sort of explains one of the first themes about the book, which is aging. And I think that makes sense, because obviously when Iris is telling her story, she starts off from when, you know, basically before she's born, up until this later point where she's in her 80s and she's really telling her story. So I found a lot of the conversation around that in the present day chapters really insightful. But as I say, she'll talk about the present day and how she's feeling and what she's doing that day, and then she'll sit down to write, and then we'll fall back into the story that she's trying to tell us. There are other sections of the book, so that will be one part, and then it will move to like a part 2. And then in the next part, we are reading a story called The Blind Assassin. And The Blind Assassin is a book that has been published posthumously after Iris's sister's death. And Iris' sister is the authoress of this book. And it's not said to be that it's non-fiction. Like, it's supposed to be a fictive tale of two lovers who have to meet, you know, in secret, and you never find out why they have to meet in secret. We don't really know, like, we know why the gentleman in it is being clandestine, but we don't really understand why the woman is. But this story called The Blind Assassin, it follows their meetings and the conversations that they have with each other. And then, you know, within those conversations, they lie in bed and they write stories together, because the gentleman is a writer. So he'll actually narrate these stories to her. So these Blind Assassin chapters are the story of them, but also the story that they are writing. And the story that they're writing is normally a sci-fi story. So that's quite interesting in itself, because then you've got like a sci-fi element within this book that's not actually a part of the main book. It's part of the smaller story that these characters within a book are writing. Complicated, I know. But that also adds another interesting element. And in these chapters where we're learning the story of the Blind Assassin, we also have news articles which are dropped in, which are meant to be, you know, non-fictional, which are, you know, things that have happened at the time that have mentioned our main character Iris or her family members who are involved in the story. So what we come to learn is that The Blind Assassin, who's written by her sister, many people think that this story is actually an autobiographical account of what her sister was doing during World War II and a love affair that she may have been having. However, this is neither corroborated by the family as being true or not. And Laura, the sister, never uses her own name in it. In fact, neither of the characters that she's talking about actually have names. But that's what we are led to believe, is that that's what this story, The Blind Assassin, is about. So that is important, because the main book starts off with Iris reflecting on her life, but the first thing that she says is that 10 days after World War II ended, her sister drove her car off a bridge. So not only is Iris recounting her own life, she's trying to recount her sister's life as well, and a lot of this is trying to come to terms, I think, with what her sister Laura actually did and why she may have done it. Because another interesting thing, if we think about the fact that, you know, World War II ended in 1945, so in that time they didn't even really want to recognise that this woman had potentially chosen to end her own life. They wouldn't even talk about it in those terms, and Iris talks about that, you know, people were trying to skirt around that fact, and it was just like, no, it must have been an accident, there must have been something wrong with the car, or, you know, but nobody ever put a great amount of investigation into proving that fact. So it was kind of like understood that yes, she took her own life, and the official word was no, she had a terrible accident. But everybody that was sort of close to her knew what the reality of it was, but they couldn't actually speak that reality to each other. And it's only in this, you know, modern day where Iris is trying to tell this story that she'd be like, yeah, actually my sister took her own life. So her sister was 25 or not quite 25 when she carried out this act. Iris is about 4.5 to 5 years older than her sister, so she would have been 29, just turning 30 when her sister did this. So she's recounting this 50 years after the event as well. So that's how we kind of understand who our two main characters are. They are Iris, who is the lady telling the story, and then her sister Laura. And obviously Laura's story is very closely entwined into Iris's. So we have like these different sections where Iris is telling the story from this is what's happening to me in the present, and now I'm going to take you back into the story. And then we have another section which is basically where we have this other story, the blind assassin, which is going on, and then that's telling its own story. And then we have news articles which are basically telling us what had been officially said about certain things that are happening at the time. From a historical perspective, this is really interesting because, for example, like you can see when it's sort of like a newspaper that's like the Toronto Gossip or whatever, then you can see actually how people would have gossiped about other people. I suppose it's their equivalent of like Hello Magazine and things like that. So how, you know, our characters are actually being spoken about. And this is another important thing to note with our characters, is that they are from, well, the classes like from high society, and they're moving in high society circles. So Iris and her sister are descended from button factory owners. So her father owns the button factory when she's younger, and he had inherited that from his great-grandfather, and that had made them very, very wealthy in the area where they live, which is just out of Toronto City in Canada, for some time. So we also have like the family business going on in the background, which I think is also key to certain themes that are going on in this book, which we will get onto in a bit. So Iris is born during World War One. She's born in 1916, and her father is at war. He goes to war, and during that war, you know, he loses his brothers and he suffers injuries himself. But then when he comes back from the war, he then, you know, continues to run his factory, and you know, this is where it gets quite interesting, because he, as a veteran himself and having suffered certain injuries which may have prohibited him from taking up other kinds of work, he really wanted to make sure that he kept employed all the men he possibly could who had had a job in his factory prior to them being conscripted off into the war. And he also made a point of hiring men who had injuries because he wanted to be seen as one of them. He didn't want to be seen as one of these bosses who essentially had emptied his factories and he didn't want to be seen as avoiding responsibility as a company owner of not hiring veterans, because he found that it was really, you know, disgraceful that there were veterans who had come back from war and they didn't have any money, they didn't have any support, and they just had no way of making a living. He didn't want to be seen like that. He always wanted to be seen different. And this sort of, over the course of the story, does bring him into trouble occasionally, because he actually spends more in his factory than maybe he should on his overheads, on hiring, you know, more people than he really needs for the amount of profit that he's actually making in the factory. So that does stretch things for the family sometimes. But this becomes really important when the Great Depression hits, which hit in America in about 1929 with the Wall Street crash. But this Great Depression obviously had a knock-on effect in Canada, so we can see that effect actually in her father's factories, you know, at the beginning of the 30s. And that's also important, I think, because during that Great Depression, we have this idea of capitalists, and then you've got a lot of, how would you put it, like, there's a lot of stuff going on in Russia at this time, which he's talking about socialism and socialist uprisings, and this is sort of feeding back, like this idea of comrades and socialism is feeding back to some of the political revolutionaries in Canada. So they are beginning to challenge people like Iris's father, who own a factory. So even though he started out trying to be a good guy, there is opposition to him, and that's gaining momentum in Canada in the form of strikes, and, you know, shutdowns, and then rioting as a result of some people not wanting to strike. So I think that's really important, and that's another theme that we can sort of pick out of this book, because, you know, we've got the idea of incompatible political ideologies. So obviously in Iris's family, they would be seen more as a capitalist family, because they have, you know, they hold the means of production in a factory, and they are, you know, responsible for the hiring of all the local people. And during the Great Depression, when they have to make cuts to who they've hired, this then has a knock-on effect, which then obviously upsets the local population. And then with the growth and interest in socialism from abroad, that then obviously gets spoken about in Canada, and we can see that in the form of rioting and sort of what happens around her father's factory. And actually her father's factory is set fire to at one point as a part of one of these protests. So we do have a political line going through this novel with that as well. And also, it's, when we're talking about politics as well, it's really important to understand that because World War II also kicks off during this novel, and is a part of this story, with the father, he's obviously got a bit of bee in his bonnet about the socialists because of the effect that that's having, and the idea of unions and what kind of effect that that's having on, you know, his factory. He, in a way, starts putting his lot in with what's happening in Nazi Germany and what, you know, Hitler is doing over there, and he's getting a lot of support for that. But then World War II kicks off, and the world suddenly is like, no, Adolf Hitler, we need to, you know, get rid of him, he is bad. And the Russians have joined the Allied forces in a way to get rid of Hitler. So therefore her father's sort of put in a position where he has to backtrack on what he's been saying about, you know, socialists and communists and Russia, because actually now officially the party line is you know, they're our allies, and we have to go against Hitler. So he has some really difficult manoeuvring to do in the social circle that he's in to back himself out of the, you know, where he was originally going with, you know, he was in support of Hitler, and now obviously he's not in support of Hitler. And the effect that this has on his daughters, you know, is interesting, because we have another character that essentially comes into this novel who is what we would call a socialist, a young man who's a socialist, that is of interest to our two characters. So their friendship with him is kind of, you know, could potentially be moulded by their father's influence on them politically. So I think politics is a really, really important thing that's happening in this novel as well. And also, you know, war, because obviously it starts off with our main character being born in World War One, and then our, you know, our secondary main character, Laura, killing herself 10 days after World War Two. And I think that, you know, we have that theme of just seeing how disruptive war is, not only to the country, but internally inside this family. You know, how destructive it has been to their father mentally as well as physically. You know, how disruptive it can be to, you know, the economy. But also how people can benefit from more in the economy as well, because there are times in this where, you know, their father's factory actually benefits from this. And then we've got the, you know, I wouldn't say the fight, but the you know, the misalignment between the idea of capitalism and socialism. We've got the Great Depression, obviously, that's affecting the economy and, you know, society. We've got ageing, and then also remembering, you know, how you can remember somebody who has taken their own life, you know, in the present day compared to how you could talk about it in the old day. And then we've also got the feminist line going through this. So what I would say is we are obviously learning about Iris, our main character, and Laura, and you know how they're actually brought up, you know, from World War One, and then Iris obviously is living up to the present day, so she's seen quite a lot of change. But obviously, when they were much younger, you know, we're just coming out of the, you know, Victorian period here, really. So you know, there were certain expectations of women. We're still a very religious country. In Canada, where women were expected to behave a certain way that was kind of in alignment with that when they were around other men. But also, you know, women weren't formally educated at this point either. So we get to see this in the you know, the two, I say girls because they start off as girls, but obviously Iris is a full-grown woman when she's telling this story. But we also get to see it in their mother. So we get a bit of intergenerational aspect to this as well, which is interesting. And you know, there are several things that like happen to their mother that, you know, is interesting, I think, because it sort of shines a light on the expectations of women at that time and the physical distress that they could go through, and you know, the health issues around childbirth, for example, and what could happen. And as a result, actually, while the two girls are quite young, their mother dies during childbirth, and they do not have another sister. I don't think that's a particularly big spoiler to the story, if I'm honest. So yeah, we've got all of these themes going on, and with regards to the generational thing with women, because you know, women were sort of had to behave in a certain way. And after our main character's mother dies, their housekeeper, Rennie, who seems to be a lovely woman who wants to raise them correctly in the social circle that they're in, and she doesn't want anybody to think badly of them. She has certain notions about, you know, how women should behave, how young girls should behave, and some of the dialogue that she has with Iris and Laura I just found really, really funny. So whilst this book is really serious and has some really serious themes, some of the dialogue I actually found really, really funny. So I'm going to read out some of my favourite conversations that the housekeeper had with the two girls. So in one respect, we've got this young gentleman came to a party that was thrown by the company. It was like a party that's thrown every year in the summer, like a summer barbecue. And the two sisters, one of them is 18 or 19, and the other one, yeah. So Laura, who's the youngest one, would have been 14, I think. And Iris, who's older, was about 19, or no, 18 and a half to 19 when this happened. And they were just sat in public talking to this man. And she says, "Don't you know any better?" Rennie said, "Sprawled on the grass with Lord knows who, and for heaven's sake, Iris, throw away that cigarette. You're not a tramp. What if your father sees you?" "Father smokes like a furnace," I said, in what I hope was an insolent tone. "That's different," said Rennie. So one, we can see here, it's perfectly okay for men to smoke, but apparently it's not okay for women to smoke. And I just really like the fact that our main character, you know, it's not lost on her that there's different expectations depending on your gender, which is why she's trying to be insolent about this. And then I think one of my favourite ones was further on in this conversation about this guy. She says, "We weren't doing anything," I said. "We were talking." "That's beside the point," said Rennie. "People could see you." "Next time we're not doing anything, we'll hide in the bushes," I said. So I think there's a good sense of humour in this book as well, and a lot of it comes from the housekeeper and how she sees boys and all different kinds of things in life, to be honest, like her views on politics, her views on men, her views on Christianity. Like, they're all really, really funny. So I enjoyed that aspect of it. And then also, you know, the father doesn't have any sons, so he's sort of left trying to raise these two daughters. with the housewife, really, and really he just doesn't have a clue. And so our character says, I became 13. I'd been growing in ways that were not my fault, although they seemed to annoy father as much as if they had been. So we can see with these two girls that they don't really fully have the greatest childhood, because whilst they've come from the privilege of having money because their father owns a factory, you know, they are motherless. They're being raised by the housekeeper, whose job isn't really to raise them, but she does, and she's a lovely woman, but you know, she's not there all the time for them, and they don't really seem to have any other family that are involved with them. So, you know, but they also don't have any proper schooling. They're not in a proper school. They sort of have somebody who comes around the house to teach them every so often, and that starts off with being somebody who's really ineffective, and then they have a really creepy man. But this schooling does not happen until they're in their teens, so it's almost like too late. So they're not educated that well to start with either, and then they also don't have, you know, a permanent mother or nanny who can really sort of raise them properly. So they're sort of left to fend for themselves, and I think that sort of sets the tone of the book, really, is, you know, they're sort of, you know, left to fend for themselves at a really early age, and then they have to undergo 2 wars. I mean, the first war, obviously their mother was around, but the second war, you know, they don't have you know, that sort of parental oversight to help them navigate that. But then they haven't really had any education either, and then the education that they have around boys is kind of like just to terrify them with, you know, the Christian fear about what they should or shouldn't do. So I suppose those are like the main points I would say about. So we can see that this novel is really involved. There's a lot of themes going on, and there's like actually a story being told within a story within a story, and then our main character is also trying to tell a story. So there's a lot of, you know, things to pull together in this book, and I think I've probably made it sound really complicated. And when you say it out loud, it is complicated, but actually as a read, I found that it read really nicely and it read really easily, and I didn't have too much problem transitioning between the different sections in the book, depending on, you know, whose story was being told, whether it was Iris telling her present day story, reminiscing, or if it was going into the story of the blind assassin in the other sections of the book. I actually found it quite easy to switch over, so that was really enjoyable. And then obviously what's really pulling this together is the love triangle that we've got going on. So we've actually got like 2 love triangles going on as well, which I think is quite interesting. So I would say now at this point, I'm going to start talking about some plot points where if you haven't read the book and you're thinking about reading the book, then you might want to skip this bit, because I'm going to actually reveal some details. So I'll just give you a second to stop the video. Okay, so the 2 love triangles that we've got going on, you actually don't realise obviously that you've got 2 love triangles going on at first. You think that you've only got the one, and I've got to be honest, like when I started reading this story, I thought that initially from the newspaper clippings that the sister Laura was having an affair with Richard, who is Iris's husband. But then obviously this Alex Thomas character comes into it, and you think, okay, because he seems to be in The Blind Assassin, the character in there seems to be you know, sympathetic to the socialist cause, and obviously Richard is not, because he's also a capitalist and a businessman, so he's got, you know, different objectives, I think, when it comes to money compared to the character in The Blind Assassin. So then I thought, oh, she must be meeting with Alex Thomas. But what was really confusing me in this was, why would they sneak in around? I mean, you knew that Alex Thomas was on the run from the law, but like really she didn't appear to be with anybody. So as I'm reading through the book into this love triangle, I'm thinking she must get married at some point, and this is why this has become clandestine or whatever. because she seems really, really like she didn't want to get caught. But from what we know of Laura's character coming through the book, actually, I sort of felt like, well, I don't think Laura would really care if people knew that she was seeing Alex Thomas. So I was a little bit confused about that, and I genuinely thought that the reveal was going to be that, you know, she had married somebody else and that's why she was meeting him in secret. But then obviously it transpires that the story is really about Iris meeting Alex Thomas. And then, you know, I think about 250 pages towards the end I'd cottoned on that I thought the story was actually about Iris. But then I was thinking, well, did Iris write this story then? And obviously Iris did write this story, that's what she kind of reveals at the end, but she's published it under Laura's name. So I think Iris does mention at the beginning of the book that the press and the people think that they know who the story was about. They think it was about Laura, and I feel that the people, the public, probably thought it was about Richard, like I did, because that was the impression that I was given, and they probably don't know anything about Alex Thomas, because absolutely nobody other than Iris knows that her and Laura hid Alex Thomas after he supposedly burned down the factory, which we never actually find out if he really did or not. Like, he said he didn't, but that doesn't mean that he didn't. But then obviously in this reveal at the end we find out, like, shock horror, Laura was actually being coerced by Richard to have an affair with Richard in order to save Alex Thomas. So you actually realise this, that you've got two love triangles going on at the end, where you've got Iris and Laura to Alex Thomas and Iris and Laura to Richard Griffin. But what makes me really, really sad about this is that Laura obviously was doing what she was doing in order to save Alex Thomas, but I don't think that she ever actually had any sexual activity with Alex Thomas in the way that Iris did. She just had absolutely no idea what Iris was doing, and that Iris was having an affair with him, and she really thought that by doing what she was doing with Richard would mean that, you know, when the war was over and he was saved, that then she could have this relationship with Alex. So I can see that she would have been absolutely devastated to find out that that was probably not going to be the case, because he was having this affair with, you know, Iris. But then also to find out that he had died was obviously going to be a major blow to her. And I think that when we look at Laura's story throughout the book, actually, you can see what a hopeless case it is. Like, both her and Iris have had a bit of a hopeless case, but I feel that Laura's in a way was somewhat worse. So we'll talk about Iris's first. Iris obviously is the eldest of the two sisters, and after her mother has died, she's expected by her father to take up the care of Laura to some extent. People always say to her, watch out for Laura, watch out for Laura, but she in herself even says, I don't have anybody to look out for me. So even though she's only a child herself, she's expected to know how to guide her sister. And even as she goes into womanhood, you know, nobody's really guiding her in womanhood. You know, things happen to her and she has to try and find out from people, like, well, you know, I'm having my period, what does this mean? Or I have to get married, what does this mean? But, you know, she's then expected to make things easy for Laura and tell Laura how it goes. You know, so I can sort of understand from Iris's perspective why she might feel a little bit resentful of that, how everybody seemed to care about how Laura would grow up, but nobody sort of seemed to care about how she was going to grow up, because nobody was sort of guiding her. And then as a result of her having to take on the reins of looking after the family to a certain extent, she's then expected to marry Richard Griffin, which is not somebody that she really wants to marry. She doesn't love this guy at all. She doesn't really like his sister, Freddie. And quite frankly, Freddie is a bit of a bully and has all these ideas about how women should be. You know, so she comes out of the home where Renee is sort of telling her, no, you can't do this and you can't do that, and, you know, people will think this of you. She goes straight into this marriage with this person that she doesn't want to, with then Freddie saying to her, no, women have to behave like this, you can't do this. So, you know, throughout her whole life, really, up until probably Richard dies, she's told how to be, how to act, and yet she doesn't have that formal education either to really go out and do something for herself, you know. And she's certainly not a stupid woman, but she hasn't really been given the right tools to start off with, to have that kind of independence. And I think that, you know, after her husband has died, she's had a bit of time by herself. But now, as she's telling this story as an old lady, you know, she's losing that independence again to her neighbour. So I feel like there's a lot of sorrow from Iris's perspective, who are our main character, because she hasn't really been able to fully live her life in the way that she wanted to. And actually, the only sort of joy really that she probably had was in this affair that she had with Alex Thomas. And writing that story called The Blind Assassin and actually publishing it under Laura's name is about the only thing I think that she's ever managed to do for herself, but she can't get financial royalties off it because she hasn't published it under her own name. So I think that, you know, that's really, really sad when we look at that from our main character's perspective. But if we start to look at Laura's position, you know, Laura has lost her mother also at a really, really, really young age, and she was never really interested in education. And there's a bit of a thing that happens when they have this male educator come into the house, where he has potentially been inappropriate with Laura. And although he'd never been with Iris, it seemed that he would like younger girls, which is maybe why he had been with Laura. So her mother has died, and now she's potentially been molested by this teacher who leaves the house. But that's probably, you know, most likely affected her given how young she was when this happened. Then her sister is married off, you know, and she can't really understand the rhyme or reason for that, because, you know, she thinks that her sister should marry for love, and her sister's trying to say, you know, like, we don't have any money and I'm doing this for our survival, you know. And obviously Laura's not in agreement with that, but then Laura gets left at home with her father, who is, we find out obviously, a raging alcoholic who locks himself in a room upstairs, having violent fits and drinking himself to death, you know. And then obviously she then finds her father's dead body when he dies of, like, I think it's a stroke or something that he dies of, probably brought on by his excessive drinking. So, you know, her sister is there sort of guiding her into adulthood, and then she goes off, marries, moves out, you know, and can't be there all the time. Then, you know, she's left at home with, you know, this individual, her father, who is not really that involved with her, and as I said, he's a drunk and he's a little bit violent. And then she finds him dead, so that's horrific. And then at this point she is left money by her father, but not until, she can't have it until she's 21. So because she's only 15 when he dies, she's then forced to move in with her sister and her sister's husband, who she absolutely detests. We find out then that during this time he has been, you know, blackmailing her into sexual relations with him, and essentially she's not, I mean, she's doing what she has to do, but this guy then gets her committed to a psychiatric hospital after he gets her pregnant, because he doesn't want people to find out that she's pregnant. So then, you know, she has to go through this psychiatric intervention where they take her away and they do God knows what to her, you know. And we know that she has to have an abortion, but when we think that they carry out electric shock therapy and some other very horrific things that used to happen in sanitariums at that time, you know. And then she eventually gets her freedom, and obviously she gets out of Dodge as quick as she possibly can, you know, with her own means then, and she's waiting for Alex Thomas to come back, who is this one man that she'd ever had a connection with, that she really, really liked. That's why she'd been having these sexual liaisons with Richard, you know. And then she has a conversation with her sister and finds out all in one go that her sister, who seems to have everything, actually already has the heart of the man that she was in love with and wanted to have a relationship with, you know. And also that the man that she was waiting for has died. So it becomes really clear to me how terrible and awful Laura's life was from when she was a kid. And as this story is being told, you know, we can see that Iris has had a really, really rough time, but Laura has had an absolutely awful time. And I think it's just really, really, really sad. And I think that it's just absolutely awful, to be honest, when we look back on both these sisters' lives, you know, and it's really sad then that Iris has had to go through the loss of her sister, and then obviously blames herself for that loss. And yet, in some regards, I'm not saying that it is her fault, but possibly the way that she delivered that information, and then Laura, being so alone in the world, didn't really have anybody to support her through that loss, you know, because it was almost like a loss. And I guess, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? The fact that her sister had done this with the man that she really loved, you know, I just don't think that she could take it. So I think that Margaret Atwood has covered so many different themes in this book. And as I say, I'm surprised it hasn't won the Women's Prize for Fiction, because I think from a woman's perspective, you know, we've really gone into detail intergenerationally between, you know, the mother and then the daughters, about what was expected of them, you know, as a child, pre-marriage, after marriage, and everything in between. Really, like, you know, absolutely outstanding. I really, really enjoyed this. I definitely think that this is a 5-star read. I recommend people to take the time out, if they can, to read this novel. Yes, it's 650 pages, but I think that it's a justified 650 pages. I didn't think there was any point when I was reading this book that there was useless text in here. I wasn't bored at any point. It all added to the story. I think that I felt quite sad when I'd finished it, obviously with the outcome at the end of the book, but also I got really close to the characters in this book as well and had a lot of empathy for them. I think this is written in a nicer way than The Handmaid's Tale, which is the other one that I've read by Margaret Atwood. I felt like The Handmaid's Tale was, I didn't think the prose was as nice. I feel like the prose in here are really, really beautiful and descriptive and just easier to absorb and take in than The Handmaid's Tale. So let me know if you've read The Blind Assassin yourself and what you thought of it. And also, I'm interested to know if you've read anything which is similar to The Blind Assassin, because I just really enjoyed this so much, and I really want to pick up another Margaret Atwood novel. So if you could, you know, either recommend another novel that's like this or another Margaret Atwood novel that you think that I'd enjoy based on the fact that I've really enjoyed this one, I'd really, really appreciate that. If you've liked this video, then please press the like button, and if you'd like to see my future content, please press the subscribe button. Thanks for watching this video today, and hopefully I'll see you soon. Bye!